Week one is in the books. Obviously, we know what has happened at this point, but what does that mean for the rest of the season? Are we right or are we wrong? How do we grade what we thought in the off season? What does that mean for the bigger picture rest of season? And how can you build your roster the rest of the way to see the success that it can achieve this season? Shawn, sometimes when we come in at this point, week one can put you on a high, it can put you on a low potentially. And if we're looking at it from like Thursday night football, we like watch that game and it's like, oh, I joked last week, I have so much Xavier Worthy. If what happens if he goes out and it's like no catches, 2 targets, has a really down week or he gets injured, and you're like, well, your season will be in a lot of trouble. But on the other side of that, if you go out and you say like, oh, he rushes one in from 30 yards and then he catches a touchdown to set things up for like a monster game as a rookie in your first ever game. Like, does that mean you're right? Does that mean you're wrong? Is it somewhere in the middle? And then obviously the surrounding parts, like it being a blow in coverage to open up the play, and how you can evaluate the rest of it. I think my point here is more so the bigger picture rather than getting bogged down in week one or week two, and more so the whole season and how to adjust and make the decisions as we move forward. One of the things we talked about a couple of weeks ago was a show that we did where it was week one doesn't matter. And my thought behind that was, we have rookies who are going to come out, they're going to struggle. We're going to have some veterans who come out maybe that either don't get the targets that maybe we think they deserve, or maybe they come out and they also struggle. And you have situations where like we have built up kind of information in our heads over the last 6 months as to how the season's going to go. And now we have 1 week where it feels like all that is either right, wrong, and the card is marked. It doesn't change from this point forward. The reality is that it changes drastically and changes very quickly. And we have to be kind of thinking bigger picture and longer term as to how to set our lineups, how to build our rosters, how to work waivers. And you have situations where like maybe somebody you drafted in the third round has a bad week one. Do you go ahead and sit them in week two? Like, we can overreact in that way as well. And I think the idea of this show is more so to set listeners' minds at ease and give them an idea as to how to move forward with the rest of the season. Something you mentioned on the Monday episode, which I thought was very good at the end, was like talking about some of the players and actually 3 players who hit in 3 different ways. And it was Jaden Reed, Jameson Williams, and Xavier Worthy, and like how their workload, like Williams, that could be his high point of the season in terms of targets, for example. Probably, the yards might be there some weeks up, but based on how he was used in the offense, the same with Reed and how he got those points or how Worthy got those points. But then the likelihood is that Worthy's targets increase throughout the season and how to build out that picture. And there's a lot of players that we would have drafted around the entire NFL. Even players like, we didn't talk about this on the Monday show, but Jaylen Wright of the Miami Dolphins was inactive for that game. So you have some players who maybe don't even make the lineup on the active game day, again, managing that rest of season. So we're going to talk through some of the elements that make week one kind of that challenge to decipher the sample size versus how to manage the rest of season. So I don't know what direction we take this show and how it turns out. I just thought it'll be a fun thought experiment. But with week one, Shawn, one thing that we focused on every year, it's important to react. Sometimes it's important to overreact, but it's trying to find that balance between the information as to how you overreact or how you react in general. And obviously we have different people and listening to shows who consume the game in different ways. Even me and you consume it in slightly different ways when it comes to watching the games. But some people might just be catching Twitter highlights, or they might be catching the highlights of the game, maybe not watching through every single game to see all the different snaps. But it can be, I've talked about social media and how it can skew people's thoughts even in the preseason with beat reporter information and that. But when you're watching clips, if you see a clip like, oh my God, how did he drop this? Or you see another clip of like, oh, what a cat. Like it skews people's opinion completely heading into the rest of the season. So it's more so of being able to make those decisions as we work through the season. I've rambled on, Shawn, for long enough. How do we fix everything that we got wrong after week one of the NFL season?
That's not where I thought you were going to leave it.
I didn't know where I was going to leave it, Shawn. I mentioned on the Monday show, we're recording this one ahead of time because I'm due to have a baby, and not me, my wife, and probably in the next 14 hours. So a lot of things went through the mind. It felt like I was going in a lot of different directions there, Shawn.
Well, for the listeners, which obviously make up the very largest portion of our audience, it's been fun to record the Monday episode and today because Colm's demeanor, his expression is completely different than usual. And Colm is a very happy, upbeat fellow. It's one of the reasons I love doing the show with him. He always puts me in a good mood. Colm is the best. The additional layer that we've had in these, again, the previous show we just recorded and now is a giddiness, just a happiness. I think it's really cool to see. And so I'm so excited for him when you have someone who is always in a great mood and now they are in this additionally elevated, even better mood, just so joyous, the joy there.
Elevated is the right word. It's almost how I felt when Xavier Worthy caught that second touchdown on Thursday Night Football.
It's like having a child and having Xavier Worthy score a touchdown are pretty similar experiences. So again,
Shawn,
we love fantasy football.
It's 57% exposure. Come on.
So Colm, the thing that is interesting about week one is that because there are so many people involved in such a high profile way in fantasy sports, and with all of the fantastic shows out there, all of the fantastic analysts, all of the amazing information, the battle of takes for 8 months, there's no way for it not to be something where you watch a game and you're so excited about the things that you're right about and so disappointed on the things that you are at least initially wrong about, that it skews the entire mindset, and it can make you bad at analysis and it can make you bad at fantasy football because much of what
results based.
Yeah. So much of what we discuss and the way that we put together our teams and our tactics are based on the idea. And this isn't necessarily unique to us, but it's certainly something that we lean into even more heavily, I believe, than most analysts and fantasy players, is the idea that there is a range of outcomes and that there are a variety of scenarios that could play out. And you want to leverage your ability to create exposure to the good ones, the ones that are going to mean something in the end. After week one, this idea that everyone agrees with, right? All of the fantastic projections that are out there, and certainly, for example, on the site, the range of outcomes tool is based on the idea that you have a range of outcomes. After week one, everything collapses to this was inevitable. This was the outcome that was always going to happen. And when you're right, you feel like, oh, I'm so good at this. When you're wrong, you're frustrated and angry. Neither of those things is the correct way to look at it, right? Other than as you're putting together teams, again, you want to stack them with the types of profiles that as the season plays out are going to allow you to create some super teams and to win with that.
Like the process has always been to, like you mentioned, build super teams as the season progresses. It's not essential. Like you want to be 1-0, you want to be 2-0, but it's not essential to be 2-0 after week 2. It's like to have the team that's going to be, getting that 1 seed at the end of the season. Now, obviously, if you're 2-0, that's easier, but it's about having the team that's surging down the end, not having a team that's like gets off to a hot start and then the players like are all, pulling the roster down like anchors rather than, pushing it forward.
Well, really what you want to do as often as possible is accomplish both things.
Yeah.
Accomplish them simultaneously. And that's really the plan that we build the entire offseason around. So when you do hit on players like Worthy and Reed and Williams, you're moving in that direction. You haven't accomplished the whole goal by any stretch. So you want to simultaneously keep the goal of fantasy football, just like the goal of life, is to be able to maintain competing ideas that are in different types of tension, but that the tensions are valuable for helping you navigate difficult environments, and you want to take the strengths of the different portions of it. So when you go out there in week one and you have a huge week, you've accomplished something that is very valuable, and you want to be looking forward to, how do I then build off of this and make sure that I'm doing everything I can to get that 1 seed, to position myself to win the league playoffs, to position myself to have the best roster for the race for the $1 million, to make sure I don't get chopped in my guillotine league, all of those types of things. If you've gotten off to a bad start, now if you had the very lowest score, you're going to get chopped in guillotine. So that part already puts you out of it. But in most formats, Colm, I always think back to a team that I had about, maybe as many as like 17 years ago now. It probably wasn't quite that long ago, but the very lowest score I've ever had in week one in a PPR format was when I scored 41 points. And you look at that team and you're thinking, this is almost certainly done, because number one, I'm just already behind from a point perspective. I've lost. And if I have so many different players who scored so poorly in week one, probably a handful of them that's going to be definitive, and I just don't have a strong enough team. That team won the league title. I'm not saying that's going to happen every time, but we want to keep in mind that if you built a roster following the right principles and have exposure to the right types of players, even a very poor week one is not definitive. And one of the frustrating things last year at this time, well, it just was that week one was horrible. Now, there were some good things that happened, but
I'm seeing a theme, Shawn. Week one was horrible, you're going to say, from an injury perspective, potentially. But I think week one, and other people may disagree, I think from a footballing perspective, like season on season, the last couple of years, like week one has been like substandard. I was looking at like our show titles from early last season, and our week two show was Fantasy Football Has Returned because week one was so bad.
Yeah, it was bad. And you lose J.K. Dobbins, you lose Aaron Rodgers, which means that now both Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall are probably not going to score as well. Those were two players that we had a lot of exposure to. Other frustrating things happened. Football was bad. And yet, in that season, you and I were fortunate enough to have a team that placed in the main event. We had a team that made the finals of the Superflex tournament. I was lucky enough to have 5 Best Ball Mania teams make the semifinals. Ben and I were lucky enough to have a team that was in the top 5 of the main event going into the final day. It doesn't always happen that way when you have a bad week one, right?
But it certainly didn't feel like that was going to happen after week one last season.
It didn't. And so you have to keep both things in mind, because the good things that happen in week one do not guarantee that you are going to win, and the bad things do not guarantee you're going to lose. The big performances from Worthy and Reed and Williams don't mean that all of those teams are going to win. The poor performances from teams like the Chicago Bears, certainly we got, the most disappointing performance of the week, and I don't think there's anything that is anywhere close, at least for me, was to have a player with the background of Jackson Smith and Jigba and the disappointing rookie season, and then you fix a lot of the problems and people are raving about you again in training camp, and you're dominating training camp, and you play a game. Like, what is possibly happening here, right? The Seattle Seahawks looked about as bad as a team that has 3 decent players and a veteran QB can possibly look. So that's disappointing, because now the range of outcomes for JSN will not collapse to a single point, are more centered around an outcome or a set of outcomes that are not good for us. But you're going to work through those different things. And one of the reasons that you draft the way that we draft is that your week one starting lineup is probably going to have a hole or two, and you need to have players on your bench with outcomes that make a difference, because you can't take the holes and replace them with players who are going to have some type of volume floor but aren't good and cannot rise to where they would help you win a league or win a tournament. Colm, one of the things that became pretty clear, I think, in week one is that there are going to be a lot of players you have to be patient with. One of the things that we got right was the idea that someone like a Marvin Harrison is vastly overvalued. And that wasn't guaranteed. He could have gone out in week one and done what Puka did last year. It was certainly not guaranteed. And you can't say, oh, well, it hit the one that I was expecting, so I was right, because someone else could have been right. But the whole point is that if you drafted Marvin Harrison, Blair and I drafted Marvin Harrison on our Big Fantasy Pros team that we did for content for the site because he came back to the end of round 2. And you're thinking to yourself, if we're going to get exposure to this player, this is where we would get it. But Colm, we did not start him in week 1, and we are set up well because we don't have to start him going forward. Now, one of the main questions that people, I think, very justifiably would ask, even if you thought it was a good price, why did you possibly draft someone in round 2 that you didn't feel comfortable starting in week 1? And now it doesn't look like you're going to be able to start for a long time. But you have to respect the uncertainty and the fact that you could be wrong, and that maybe if you're going to do a handful of these teams, you want to get a good price, and that even if you don't start Marvin Harrison now for the next 2 months, he could be the guy who wins you the $1 million in the Fantasy Pros contest. But your entire roster on all of your teams needs to be set up with those types of ideas in mind in order to maximize the value of each pick and to maximize the quality of each roster.
And all of that is, I agree with, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Shawn, because we didn't draft Marvin Harrison. I think we drafted him in a team at the very end after we talked about players that we could regret not drafting. My thing with Marvin Harrison, the draft price may make this a little bit tricky. So if we take the draft price out of it and just talk about rookies here, like in that same game, we have Trey McBride, who gets 9 targets, which is 5 for 30. And I talked at the end of the Monday show where, like, Kyler Murray, there's like multiple times Trey McBride's just open over the middle. It's like an 8-yard completion, like every time he's open.
Can't see him.
I don't think he can see over the line of scrimmage. I'm pretty much convinced of that at this point. So if you do not get Trey McBride running, across the formation and then he gets past the last lineman, we mightn't get those completions to Trey McBride. But the part that I'm mentioning here is, like, people will be like, well, you drafted Trey McBride in round 1. Like, why did you do that? That was a waste of pick. Like, we're going to start Trey McBride next week. And we're going to start him the week after. And we're going to start him the week after. And it's like with Marvin Harrison, like, we're 1 weekend, he had 3 targets, 1 reception for 4 yards. That is, in my opinion, scandalous usage from the Cardinals of their rookie pick. But in terms of how that could play out in week 2, we can see a situation where, all of a sudden he might only have 6 targets, but has 4 receptions for 80 yards and a touchdown. Then it's like, well, I was right. Like, not me, but I mean the person who's on the opposite side of it. So we're on the Trey McBride side. That's the Marvin Harrison side. But I think when we look at all rookies in general, and this was kind of the point that I didn't make properly a minute ago when I'm talking about like the 0-1 and the 0-2, you're looking at the team progressing as the season goes on. Then you get into the bye weeks where your team should have the depth to, soar past some of those other rosters. But you mentioned the phrase about being patient. And I do think being patient with, you might have to be patient with some of these veterans, but some of the rookies as well. Or there'll be some people this week who had, let's say, they had J.K. Dobbins on the bench, and they're like, I should have played J.K. Dobbins. I started Chuba Hubbard instead, for example. And obviously that's, in hindsight, not the right call. But then people are going to put J.K. Dobbins in for the week 2 slot in their team this week, as their second running back. And maybe he just goes like 10 for, 32, no touchdown. And then, like, all of a sudden, again, it's like that up and down, like a roller coaster of emotions every week. There is part of it that there's going to be players that you do have to be patient with as the season goes on. You don't really want to have to be patient with your first round pick in fantasy football. But, we could be here in week 2 and the Cardinals do something completely different where they're not facing the Buffalo Bills. Like, they are playing the Rams, which we have seen an example, obviously, of Jameson Williams, doing a little bit of damage against them. Maybe Marvin Harrison has something for them in week 2, and then the picture changes again. So I do think, like, being patient, and rather than just deciding I was wrong, I shouldn't have made that pick, and then benching him this week, I think you still play him. I think it's one of those kind of potential week 1 overreactions. But how big is patience to what you need to do for the rest of the season?
I think it's patience within the larger context of continuing to build out your roster and creating exposure to the types of big games that matter. We were discussing the guillotine. Your team in our league didn't play that well in general, but it got a huge performance from Jayden Reed and is going to easily advance as a result. So in week 1, in week 2, the managers who got locked in volume and had the player play well feel very good about the conservative approach. And some of those conservative approaches are going to work. And in no way, shape, or form are we saying that that's guaranteed to fall apart in week 4 or week 5. But generally speaking, I say generally speaking, the evidence tells us that that is not the best way to play over the long haul. And so we don't play that way. You don't come out of week 1 then and say that the exact thing that you expected to happen, which is that the teams with the best locked in volume and the most projected points in week 1, we're going to do a little better than teams that are built more around scenarios and contingent upside, that you should have done it the other way when everything that we knew was going to happen happened, but with the additions of some of the players that we thought we might need to be a little bit more patient with, like Worthy, like Williams, I would argue that maybe the idea that patience was going to be necessary with Jayden Reed was overstated. It's easy to argue that after he has a big game. But
I do think there's no doubt, though, with him, there will be like a...
Well, now you have to be patient. So that's the thing with injuries. Like now, as your roster gets worse at the same time that it's getting better, because you have players hurt, you've got to work through those types of elements. But Colm, the other thing is, again, just how are you drafting and how did you set your team up? So for example, the team that I just referenced that I drafted with Blair, the receivers that we started this week were CeeDee Lamb, Stephon Diggs, Deebo Samuel, and Xavier Worthy. And if you've drafted it that way, and then partly you've drafted that way because you get the free look on Worthy, it was very straightforward to not start Marvin Harrison in week 1, even after where we drafted him. And so this kind of gets back to that question of, why do you draft 0 RB, or why do you draft with a roster that has certain elements in place if you're not going to start one of your high leverage picks in week 1? And this is the reason, because you're going to have misses, you're going to have injuries, and you want to win all the weeks, but arguably the least important one is that very first one. It does look like we are going to win because you get the big game from Stephon Diggs. You get a solid game from James Conner, who was a back that we've talked about as being undervalued. We got the 30 points from Jaden Daniels. I mean, this is a team where, because of the way the draft fell, we have both Jordan Love and Jaden Daniels. We didn't love it, but you don't give away massive value in a draft simply because you're weaker at a different position. And the reason that we could potentially lose this week is not because we have Marvin Harrison. Well, I mean, maybe it is, in that we could have used that pick on a tight end, but the tight ends didn't score. We had to play Jatavian Sanders, who also didn't score. You can argue that maybe this team is better off because it was such a lousy week. Our opponent got 1/10 additional point from Evan Ingram. So the Evan Ingram drafters are not super happy about that one either.
But that's another one, I guess, of the, week 1. Like I've talked on the podcast a lot. Like a lot of my best ball teams this year, I focused on getting 2 elite tight ends. So like elite tight ends didn't have, like, we're waiting here. We're recording this before Thursday Night Football. Maybe George Kittle goes off, for example. But realistically, like, we're not in a situation here week 1 and we're in. I would imagine if you go on social media, there's a lot of people saying, like, look at these, like, Bozo's drafting elite tight end. Like, elite tight end doesn't work because it didn't perform in week 1. But like when we get to week 10 and these elite tight ends are blowing the other guys out of the water, like I want.
Yeah, there's no concern.
No concern.
Elite tight end. There are concerns about individual
elite tight
early
ends.
Drafted tight ends.
Yeah. But I also don't think that, like, there's, like, Mark Andrews is probably the height of that list, Shawn, at the moment. But we won't dive in specifically to that example. But I do think there's a lot of ways that
I'm much less concerned about Mark Andrews than I am about Dalton Kincaid and Travis Kelce.
Yeah, well, Dalton Kincaid as well. Yeah, there's a few there. That Bills game against the Cardinals, I'm hoping that that's like an enigma where it was just everything kind of went a little bit askew in that one. The part I wanted to get to, Shawn, when we're talking about like building out zero RB rosters, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who have built out a team where maybe Chase Brown, or the specific example I was going to talk about was Jaylen Warren versus Najee Harris. That was a split that I just did not see coming this week for the Pittsburgh Steelers, with a 20 carries to 2 in favor of Harris. That's one where, like, if you have built out a zero RB roster and that's your RB1, you're heading into week 2. There's a lot of information there from the team as to how they played this one out. Do you think there's part of that down to maybe Warren's coming into this and they're like, well, maybe an extra week if we don't have to go with him would be better for his recovery from injury? I generally think when the team suits a player up that, they're okay to play at that point. But I was shocked by the split there between those two targets apiece as well in terms of the passing game.
Yeah, I think we want to understand the profiles of the players and default to the bigger picture, especially at running back, where things can change so quickly. While week to week, working through the appropriate calculations to get the best players in your starting lineup that week. So the team that I just mentioned with Blair, the second running back that we started was Jaleel McLaughlin, who didn't have a good fantasy score, but actually looks extremely well positioned going forward. The only way that McLaughlin doesn't absolutely annihilate ADP at this point is if Bo Nix is tragically bad, which is within the range of what could happen, but to me still seems very unlikely. I'm not that worried about that one. I'm much more worried about the Chicago Bears, because that thesis requires Caleb Williams to actually successfully pass the ball to receivers. If you have drafted DJ Moore or Keenan Allen or Roma Dunze, it requires the offense just to function completely differently. That seems like a tougher road. The only reason that people are more down on Bo Nix than Caleb Williams is because Caleb Williams is
the one. I think it's down to the one team won, one team didn't. Like, that would have been the fun part,
right? Again, I mentioned this on the show with Ben, but it would have been amazing to get the ball back for Nix and to see if he led them to the touchdown. I guess for me, it was just that, the perception of the two players is completely different.
Yeah.
Well, but the reality is that Caleb Williams was more disappointing than Bo Nix was. And I say that as someone who loves Caleb Williams, has a lot, and will continue to have some. But they looked farther away from being a real NFL offense than the Broncos, who threw the ball a lot. And you throw into coverage, you make some
rookie
bad passes.
Rookie errors is what I would call them.
It's very different than someone like a Zach Wilson, or I would even argue a Bryce Young, where, they're not throwing the ball with any rhythm or any sense of tempo within an NFL offense. So again, but I don't think it needs to come down to that type of thing. But you look at McLaughlin and you're thinking, okay, this profile works. You look at the situation with Harris and Warren, and the volume setup there is catastrophic. Listeners will know that Warren is somebody that I've had a lot of trouble with this offseason, because it's a weird confluence of factors that create a much more dramatically wide range than for almost any other type of player. Because on the pro side, you have Warren's price, which doesn't seem to fit a player who is in a committee and is amazingly good. And then also on the pro side, you have the fact that he's amazingly good. So those are two very powerful things. On the con side, you have the issue with the offensive context being, in all likelihood, extremely low scoring. And then quarterbacks who will probably neutralize the key element of his performance, which is catching passes and being the receiving back. If you have that part neutralized, then it doesn't even matter how good you are. Where do you go with that? And then it gets worse when you have that massive carry split, because if you're not going to be able to thrive in the passing game, you have to carry the ball. I guess I think that because Warren is so good that he's not anywhere close to being healthy.
Yeah, and
you can't have that split if he's healthy, because he's a better back. I just don't think we talk all the time about the fact that you can't expect rational decision making from the coaches, but you just simply do not get that type of decision making from people who know football if Jaylen Warren is even 85%. So that's always the risk that you have when you spend a pick on someone who's coming off of an injury, is that you simply don't know. And I think that you want to bet on talent if the talent and then the future situation works. So for Jonathan Brooks, you're going to miss the time, but you're thinking they're going to be patient. When he comes back, he'll be pretty close to fully healthy, and then the context works. Now, the problem that we have there is that there is a lot of reason to believe that now the context won't work. With Warren, it was an issue of, if you're going to potentially start somebody who has this big red flag, you could take close to zeros, but then you also don't know if the context is ever going to work. It's one of the reasons we were drafting a lot more Brooks than Warren. Both of those plays could be wrong. Also, another similar play that we made at that similar price in Chase Brown could be wrong. So you're going to make mistakes, and your roster has to be built in a way that you can weather those mistakes and that your roster continues to get better. And that includes simply understanding the right types of stashes. Players who were inactive this week are going to make a huge difference later in the season. So if you have Wright or you have Vital, you have some guys like that we have a lot of, I think you still have plenty of reason to be enthusiastic. If you have guys like Colm that we have very little of, similar thing, right? Reason to be enthusiastic in the future. It's not all or nothing with that. If you drafted Colm originally, yeah, you're probably disappointed because you thought you were going to get more, but it doesn't mean that he couldn't still be the guy in the second half of the fantasy season. Not just on the Rams, but in all of fantasy football.
There's some great stuff there at the end in terms of the players and the outlooks the rest of the way. But yeah, it's a case you knew the chance was that these guys as well, like it's a zero RB roster, that these players might take that little bit of time to come along. So again, having that patience along with it. But Shawn, a couple of things that came into my head as well that we didn't talk about on Monday that I wanted to highlight. The Cleveland Browns, one of the things that was bothering me, I mentioned we'll watch the game slightly different. I tend to watch with the volume on to hear the announcers, but this week I almost had to I was putting the volume down more and more as it went on. But I think the tipping point for me was when Tom Brady was doing the commentary in the Dallas Cowboys game. It wasn't him, it was the person with him, but Deshaun Watson rolls out, ducks out of a potential sack and tosses a ball and it's an incompletion. He's like, oh my, that was almost vintage Deshaun Watson. And I'm like, how far are we going back here? Vintage Deshaun Watson now is the stat line that he has put up this week, 24 of 45. That is, vintage Deshaun Watson. Another poor performance. But some of the enthusiasm of some of the running backs this week where it's oh, he really showed burst there, and it's it's a 4-yard run for somebody. We need to stop overhyping these. But the other part I wanted to mention that wasn't commentary related, Shawn, but you talked about, a quarterback that was overthrowing Calvin Ridley, and Calvin Ridley not getting maybe some of the service. The pick six from Will Levis this week in that Bears game, you were talking there about the differences between Bo Nix and Caleb Williams, and I think you're talking about more of the bigger picture. But coming out of the week's games, I think the difference is one had a really bad game but won the game. The actual result of that W had really nothing to do with the quarterback play. The quarterback play of the Titans had a big part to do with it, but the toss play that he's pitching it off to the side, just returned for a pick six, that is laughably bad. Will Levis can't be doing that. But I do think things,
that
you know,
play is one.
The wins not being a quarterback stat. You know, people talk about wins and losses for quarterbacks, and like this is why it's not a quarterback stat, because this had nothing to do with Williams' play. And I do think that his perception after the weekend, he'll get a little bit of a pass because the team won.
I don't know. I don't know if he will.
I think he does.
The other player along with Marvin Harrison that I just simply didn't understand the price on, but I wanted to make sure I got some because I liked a lot of the circumstance, and I think it makes sense to have some humility with the evaluation and with your understanding of the context, and also understand again just how wide the potential range is. As we were talking, I believe on Monday, and the fast starts or not from different quarterbacks and the patience that you might want to have. If you drafted Caleb Williams and he's got DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, who by the way looked fine, he was not the problem in terms of getting open. It was a problem in terms of he dropped maybe the key pass in the game. That part of it you're not as concerned about as just whether or not he can get open and draw targets. You have Rome Odunze. You have Cole Kmet, who again scored over 200 points last year in tight end premium. You have the potential to come out and look like what CJ Stroud looked like. But it's not just CJ Stroud. We had the situation in 2020 with Justin Herbert, where in week 2, you have the unfortunate circumstance with Tyrod Taylor. Justin Herbert forced into action. He goes for 311-1 in his first start, 330-1 in his second, 290-3, 264-4, 347-3, 278-3, 326-2. A mildly down week where he doesn't throw for 200, but gives you still 2 more passing touchdowns. Then goes 366-3, 316-1. It's not good that Caleb Williams looks so bad. It's a mistake, I think, to completely give it a pass, especially when you're surrounded by that much receiving talent, because it shows either a problem with the quarterback or a problem with the coordinator that they simply should not have had. You have to look better than they looked. Rome Odunze, not startable probably for a long time now. Keenan Allen, startable, but not necessarily exciting. I mean, DJ Moore maybe not startable in week 2. Caleb Williams, not startable in week 2. While we want to be patient, you also have to realize that some of those picks are a problem, and the reason that you would have built some depth into your roster and the reason that you're going to be proactive in free agency is because you need to now bridge the gap. You've got to weather the storm. You've got to come through with your team and keep it in the mix, because potentially in week 6 or week 7, Caleb Williams will be the high scorer. Rome Odunze will be a big part of the offense, and your team still works and will win. But you have to have it built out with contingencies so that if you're willing to take a play like Odunze that has the potential to be a terrible play, both in the short term, maybe for the whole season, but has that upside at some point, the rest of the roster has to be built so that you can still be successful. It can't be a situation where you've taken Odunze and now you're done.
The one note, Shawn, just to add on Odunze, expected to have an MRI as we record this on Monday, so there will be potentially some different news around that, but it does seem like it, hopefully at this point, will be mild in terms of the injury outcome, but anytime there's a player having an MRI, always a little bit of a concern. But hopefully people have enjoyed our little dive into kind of a bigger perspective of the rest of season and, you know, the overall off-season process versus 1 week of data. But that is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz Overtime. We will be hopefully back later in the week with another podcast, but we will play that one by ear. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OvertimeIreland. You'll be able to find the podcast if you are subscribed to RotoViz Overtime on your favorite podcast player. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.